On the Strong Women podcast today, Erin and I are sitting down and just looking back over the year and some of the wonderful conversations that we've had. One of our goals in our vision, Erin, has been to tell these stories of women who are walking faithfully with Christ in their spheres of influence and, doing the next good thing that's in front of them that God has gifted them to do. And it's been so fun, and it's definitely sparked my imagination. And that's our goal, is that our imaginations will be sparked by these wonderful stories to kind of encourage us in our own spheres of influence. Well, how can I walk this out faithfully with Christ in my own sphere of influence? We've talked to a lot of women who are involved in the pro-life movement, and I think that their stories really demonstrate the point that we're trying to make, that it will look different in the different spheres of influence, in the different vocations, with the different giftings.
Yeah, that's a good example of the pro-life topic, of the different stories we've highlighted of how that will look so different depending on the woman.
Yeah.
And so we've talked to Kathy Lesnoff and Catherine Wheeler, who were both involved in performing abortions. They've come out of that, and then that's pushed them in different directions, even both of them, what they're doing now. We talked to Brittany Smith and Natasha Smith, and they are passionate about the pro-life movement, and so they've used their giftings in writing and reporting and journalism to bring awareness to the topic. And then we talked to Janique Stewart and Megan Allman, who are also passionate about the pro-life movement, and so they use their giftings of communication and teaching to, especially with young people, train young people on how to think about the topic of the pro-life movement. And then we have an upcoming interview with Lila Rose, who has a whole organization that's fighting for the pro-life movement in the public square. So our vision of highlighting, the uniqueness of how God has made us. And, we open our show with saying we want to have a deeper understanding of the humanity and value and intellect and creativity of women. And so looking at these different stories highlights those things.
Through all these different women, they saw the brokenness, and they said, okay, let me speak to that. But they spoke to it, like you pointed out, in different ways. But I just wanted to bullet point. They spoke to it through story, through relationship, through education, through exposing the wrong, through advocating, especially from a medical perspective with Catherine, which that's a very unique perspective. And then training, like with Janique and Megan.
Beauty was another one I had thought of. So we talked to K.B. Hoyle about beauty in the arts. She's a writer, and how to think about it. We talked to Megan Allman. Remember, she talked about beauty can be an act of war.
Yes.
And I love that part in the interview. And we talked to, Jessica Hooten-Wilson about the beauty in Flannery O'Connor's writing. But just, a bigger perspective of what beauty is, and then how that can be worked out in our lives.
Right. And then Ash Marsh has this whole, she and her husband basically revitalized this small town of Opelika, Alabama. And so she sees beauty in the creating spaces for people. Yeah. So there's another example of promoting the good and the beautiful, but from very different angles and with different giftings. So we just wanted to draw that out because you listeners and us, Erin and I, we're gifted differently. And God's laid different things on our hearts, ways to bring his kingdom, ways to bring heaven and earth together, and to speak truth and love in this, wherever our spheres of influence are. And so we hope that you find encouragement that it doesn't have to look like your neighbor, it doesn't have to look the same. What was another interview that stood out to you this year?
As we were preparing for this and I was looking through all the interviews this year, I I could sit with you and talk about each interview and say the things that I learned from that person. So it's really hard to nail down. I think the interview with Christopher West, I think is one of our most popular interviews.
Yeah. Do you find that you quote that to people all the time?
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, well, when I was talking to Christopher West.
Yes. I refer back to that interview or his book all the time.
Me too.
So that had a huge impact on me. And I've recommended his book and had friends and people that I know buy the book, read it, and be totally transformed in their thinking about our bodies and creation and all of that that he talks about in his book. That interview, that time with him, and then his book has had a huge impact on me. So that was definitely one of those ones that I haven't stopped thinking about. I loved our interview with Glenn Stanton and the Beyond Pink and Blue, and where we just talked about the beauty of the two genders, how God designed us. And what did Glenn say about, we can't talk in totalities, but
right.
we can.
We tend towards. We can say that.
Yeah. And I love that. That has had a big effect on me too. Even how I talk about, in general, men this, and I've said what Glenn said, we can't talk in totalities,
right.
but we can talk in generalities. And I love, and with Shanti Feldman too, about the difference between men and women, because I think it highlights another value of our podcast, that we value men too. It's called the Strong Women Podcast. So we're highlighting stories of women, but we don't see that separated from also honoring men, in how we talk about things and all of that. Of course, we've had many male guests on the podcast to talk about different things, and I love that we do that.
And like Tammy Jo Schultz, remember
Yes.
that interview? She talked about how she was on some board and they were doing a study about
Yes.
how men and women work together. And they studied the productivity of men and women in groups with just, women with women, men with men. And then they studied productivity when they're together and how it went up exponentially. And I just think, of course, that's true, because we were made for friendship. I mean, not just in marriage, but we were made to build the kingdom together, and we need each other. And so I love that we have men on our podcast too, because we need each other. We need to hear from each other. We need to learn from each other, and we need to be friends together. And I'm glad that we can do that. I'm glad that we have good friends, good male friends that we can invite on. And I loved hearing from Steve Grayson and about his mom. That was really cool. She's a cool lady, and I would love to meet her someday. But
was that one of your favorite episodes this year, or what were some that stood out to you as we both kind of personally reflected on the year?
That's so hard, isn't it, to narrow it down? I just feel that I have learned so much from doing this podcast together. I mean, it really, to me, is like little mentoring moments, because, when we talk about mentoring is more of a posture of always being ready to learn, and then also being ready to invest in others too. There's kind of that give and take there, especially since we're mature women. I don't know. I don't want to say older women, but I guess that's what we are. But I just have learned so much, and I'm so grateful for the wisdom that our guests have brought, and I hope our listeners feel the same way. Steve's episode was one of my favorites. I just adore Steve and think his mom must be a saint, because I know stories about Steve and I think, wow, I can't believe she survived as a mother. But and then I really enjoyed the episode that we did with Barronelle Stutzman. And one of the things that I learned from that conversation, or maybe one of the things that was just sunk down deeper into my heart, is that we know that, and this actually is another theme, is that God is with us in our suffering. And, we saw that with Virginia Prodan, who was one of my favorites. I just loved her story. And I think maybe her story and Bare Nails at the same time demonstrate this tangible reality that is always good to have a tangible story to tack it to, is that God is with us in our suffering. There's the C.S. Lewis quote about pain that I'm not going to remember right away, but basically he says he yells at us in our suffering, like he's shouting loudly to us in our suffering. We hear it more clearly because we're more desperate, And I think both of those stories demonstrate that. They both showed what truth and love can look like together in a relationship, in a actual situation, boots on the ground. Is it real? Yeah, well, we can see from their story, yes, it's real. It's real that God is with us. It's real that he speaks to us in our suffering. And it's real that truth and love do go together. And so I learned a lot from both of their stories. It just really sunk in deeper to me.
Yeah, it's powerful to hear from women and men, but it's powerful, the women that we've heard from this year who have joy through suffering.
Yeah.
And Barnell, Virginia,
Jean
Sutherland,
yeah.
To name a few, Missy Wallace with her daughter's disease. There's so many that we've heard from this year that have struggled and suffered in different ways, and it's really powerful to hear their story, and they're not bitter, they're not even angry.
Remember, Jean has gone through 3 rounds of cancer, and her second round, she was vulnerable and told us that she really struggled with anger towards God, and she was bitter, and it took her a while to even acknowledge, like, oh, I'm actually angry and bitter towards God. And then she wrestled through that, prayed through that. And then remember she said, so the 3rd cancer was actually my best. And we're like, what?
Yes. Well, the second cancer, when she was talking to us about that, the part where I broke down in the interview was when she said the second time she felt like she was walking through a snowstorm with God. Do you remember? And then when she got the news about the second cancer coming, she felt like God pushed her out into the snowstorm on her own. And just her vulnerability of that feeling. It reminded me of Lewis's A Grief Observed that he wrote when his wife passed away, and just the honest, the raw of the Psalms. It's what we hear in the Psalms too. But anyway, yeah, it's so powerful to hear when people are humble and honest. And actually, it reminds me too, one thing we like to do throughout the podcast is highlight historical women. And the women we've highlighted this year, the women of the Reformation, Elizabeth Elliot with Ellen Vaughn, all of their stories have suffering and struggle. And then to hear what they said and wrote through that is so powerful. And so that's another theme of the podcast. Another part that I love is that we talk about women that we can learn from the past.
Yeah.
And
I love that we can bring in the things we love, because both of us love history. We both love books, and so it's fun to be able to bring a little bit of that into our conversations.
Yeah, we've gotten a lot of comments from you listeners that your Amazon cart is full because of us.
Yeah,
and we
welcome.
Don't really apologize for
No.
that. Because hopefully we've pushed you towards good books and good things to read.
As you can see, it's definitely impacted Erin and I this year, and we've enjoyed this project so much. And we've heard from a lot of you guys that you're enjoying these conversations and growing along with us. And so we wanted to just read a couple of the comments that we've had from listeners.
Yeah, so we got a comment recently that I thought was so encouraging, where she said, listening to the Strong Women podcast has been such an encouragement to me the past few months. My baby has been in the NICU for 12 weeks now, and listening to the podcast has helped pass the time at the hospital and on the drives back and forth. Hearing about other women's faith has played a part in increasing my own faith in God's goodness during this time of suffering, which was so encouraging to hear, because that has been our hope, that by sharing the stories of the women that we highlight on the podcast, that it would encourage all of you listening in different ways. And here's a story of a mom with a baby who's suffering, and different stories are somehow encouraging her faith. You know, it's kind of a mystery in some senses, but exactly what our hope is from the stories of just these ordinary people living out their lives faithfully. But yeah, you picked another comment too.
Yeah, I really liked this comment, because another one of our goals is that we want you to feel welcome into this conversation. We want you to feel like you're having coffee with us and that we're becoming friends. And we do feel like our community is becoming a community of friends, and that's really fun to see. Both of these comments were on the Apple Podcast app. So this girl, the title is Like Coffee with a Friend, which I was like, hey, she gets us. She says, I love visiting with such a wide variety of strong and godly women as I listen to the podcast. My world is expanded, my spirit is refreshed, and my imagination is stoked while listening. Which I think that's so encouraging, because that's how I feel about these conversations. And I feel like we can say that because our guests carry the heavy lifting in the podcast. So it's not like we're so great, but we're like, these conversations with these guests are just so amazing. Side note, a little commercial and maybe an ask for you listeners is, if you do enjoy the podcast, we would love to hear your feedback on Facebook and Instagram and things like that. But also, if you could write a review on Apple Podcasts, that makes it more visible for other people to find us. And so that would be much appreciated.
And we just love hearing from you guys and hearing the different challenges you're going through and the different ways that God is using these stories to encourage you. Because like you said, Sarah, we feel like we're just shoulder to shoulder with all of you listening, learning and being mentored by all of our guests too.
Yeah, that's a really good way to say it.
We love hearing from you guys and getting feedback like this. So definitely do that.
Mm-hmm. And one more thing, this is a project of the Colson Center, the Strong Women podcast, and we're so grateful for the Colson Center and all that they do to make this Strong Women podcast possible. So if you would like to do some end of the year giving and you're looking for, where should I give? Well, how about the Strong Women podcast through the Colson Center? You can go to colsoncenter.org/SW Hope to give your donation. So thanks so much for all of your support. Thanks for hanging with us for another year, and we're looking forward to another year together.